Jai Baba, everybody. Thank you. Jai Baba. Thank you for having me. This is a pretty surreal experience. I spent my whole life watching, my parents, the twins, various mandali members sitting up on stage giving these talks like this and telling their stories. So it's pretty weird to be sitting up here and doing the same. I guess the reason I'm here is because, well, first, pardon me, my throat's a little sore and hoarse. So if you guys can't hear me, I'll just wave a hand and I'll speak a little louder. But the reason I'm here is because at the Southeast Gathering last year, my mom and dad were invited to be speakers, and somebody came up with the idea that it'd be cool for me to give my side of the story, so to speak, about growing up in a Baba family. Well, I kind of told the story and don't remember a word of what I said. So today will be probably completely new and different, but I'll share with you what I can. I guess the bookends of what I'm going to speak about is reconciling what I consider sort of some extraordinary events around how I was born and how my parents got married with what feels like every day a very ordinary life. And so let's start at the beginning, shall we? As Sue Jameson said, my parents were, well, let's start even before that. If you look back far enough, you'll find that Baba has a way of connecting dots long before you knew that he was even doing that. My mom, Irani, was born into a Baba family. Her father was Shatrughan Kumar, a very devout Baba lover that lived in Dehradun. Her story in and of itself is incredible. Her grandmother, when she was a child, this is my mother's grandmother, this is my great-grandmother, met a must when she was a child. And some 60 years later, Baba had asked her to find this particular must and bring this must to Ahmednagar, and it was the same person. So even as far back as then, going back 3 generations, Baba had reached out with a small sign to this little girl that had met this must in the forest, that one day you'll be mine. But when my mom was born, Baba held my mom in his lap, and told my mom's parents, Kumar and Shubhadra, that I've already decided who the perfect husband for this person is. So that perfect husband, which my mom would argue, was my dad, Dara Irani. And my dad was born to Baba's brother Adi and his wife, his first wife, her name was Gulnar. So my dad was born in Vilu Villa, and when he was born, his mom, Gulnar, passed away. And she died a few hours after he was born. So his mother's sister was Vilu. Many of you may have known from trips to India, Vilu Irani. And she adopted my dad and sort of raised him as her own. So when the time came for both of them to be married, Baba arranged essentially their wedding. As he had promised my mom's parents that he had already picked the perfect boy, he kind of arranged all the details of the two of them to be married. You guys have all heard my mom and dad's story, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that, and I'm sure you'll hear them talk again. But in essence, this is where in my mind, sort of what I call the extraordinary events surrounding my genesis, I guess, started, right? This was the last public act that Baba did, arranging their marriage. You guys have probably seen the incredible video and the footage of that last particular public sort of event that Baba held. And when my mom and dad were eventually, the wedding ceremony was done and finished, my mom stayed on in Meherabad for a couple more weeks after the marriage. And that's when sort of, I come into the picture, so to speak. So while staying at Meherabad, my mom describes it as this incredible time staying with Baba in the last days of his life. She went to ask Baba, along with her mother, how long do I have to live in England with this man I just married? And because she didn't know, when she went to England, if she'd ever come back to India. She was 18 at the time. And Baba thought about it for a second, and then, signed that you can come back from England with your husband after you have one boy. And he used the finger, this for penis, to mean boy. And the thought popped into my mom's head while she's standing there in Baba's room, and Baba's in his bed. Well, that could be pretty quick, right? I could be back in a year. And Baba, almost as if reading her thoughts, stopped and said, waved his hand and said, I have many, many beautiful souls in my godown. And godown means warehouse. And he said, I'll give you 2 boys. And then he spelt out my name and said, name the first one, Meherwan. So it's not Baba's name. Baba's name is Merwan, Meherwan. But it was many, many years later that I found out that actually Meherwan is a contraction for the old Persian name Meherwan. It's a Parsi contraction. And it used to bother me for a long time why Baba didn't name me after him, why he spelt my name differently. And I didn't know, obviously it was intentional because he went out of his way to spell it out with the H in the middle there. And for most of my life, everybody thought my name was Meherwan after Baba, but actually it's Meherwan as named by him. And it was only many, many, many years later that I found out that it was actually the original Persian version of the name Meherwan. And then he looked at my mom and dad and said, and these 2 souls I will give you will be Love and Kush. Are you guys familiar with the Ramayana or the Lord Rama? Baba's talked about himself. So Ram, one of the 7 gods, and one of the original gods of India, the first one, he had 2 sons named Love and Kush. And it's a very tragic story between Ram and his sons. To make a long story short, because Baba was very intentional when he said Love and Kush, because my mom knew this story. What happened with Ram was that after he rescued his wife Sita from exile and brought her back, he was in the kingdom incognito, and he overheard a washerman, a dhobi, berating his wife who he thought had been unfaithful. And he overheard the washerman telling his wife, do you think I'm Ram, that I would take you back so easily after you've been somewhere else? And Ram realized that in order for his people and his kingdom to view him as their perfect Lord and Master, that he would have to send Sita again back into exile, because he couldn't stand the thought of people thinking anything impure about her. So while Sita was in exile, she had these 2 boys, Love and Kush, and they grew up not knowing who their father was, and they grew up not knowing that their father was Ram, the Lord of the age. And when they grew up into young boys, essentially, both them versus Ram, through a set of circumstances, had a battle with each other. And Ram was on the verge of killing those 2 boys in the midst of this battle when Sita came out and told them, stop, what are you doing? You're about to kill and murder your own children. And she was so distraught that she asked the earth to open up and swallow her. Pretty tragic story. And this is what Bob was laying on my mom, that the 2 boys will be Love and Kush. And he saw the absolute look of panic on her face. And he even asked my dad, said, do you know who Love and Kush are? And my dad, of course, had no idea about Indian history because he had grown up in England. And my mom said, and Baba then sort of almost waved it off and said, that's okay, I won't give you Love and Kush. Almost as if that burden would be too much to bear. And he said, instead, I'll give you Dhruv and Prahlad. And Dhruv and Prahlad are 2 figures in Indian mythology, 2 boys that are renowned for their love of their Lord Vishnu. Dhruv was, again, sort of cast away by his evil stepmother and was told that his father, the king, was not his father. And Dhruv went out into the forest then looking for his father, who he believed to be God. And he prayed so hard, and his devotion to the Lord was so much that Lord Vishnu appeared in front of Dhruv and gave him a glimpse of God and said, yes, I am indeed your father. And then told Dhruv, you'll be forever known as the North Star because your love will guide people forever. And Prahlad is another mythological figure in Indian mythology of another boy whose love for the Lord was so great that when attempts were made in his life to kill him by his evil stepfather, again, Vishnu appeared as a half man, half beast, killing the father and essentially giving Prahlad immediate enlightenment. This is pretty heavy stuff, right? So now, bear in mind, I don't know any of this growing up as a child, right? I'm born in London because that's where my parents went, as is my brother Jamshed. And by the way, his name was given by Mera, because my mom, after Baba gave my name, sort of circled back and said, well, what about the second boy? So Mera and the women mandali came up with the name Jamshed. I went back to Baba and asked Baba if he approved, and Baba said yes, he approved of that name. So I was born in London, and at the age of 4, my parents brought me and my brother, who at the time was about 3 months old, back to India to live in Vilu Villa. So I grew up in a very sort of interesting time in Vilu Villa, because that was the time where all of you were coming to India to learn more about Meherabad. And all of those folks that were coming to India were staying in Vilu Villa, which was my grandmother's house in India. So I grew up with a very interesting perspective of what it means to be a Baba lover. I was born into the family. So in my mind, being a Baba lover was just a matter of, just natural, just a matter of course. But to see people coming to India that were seeking him out and having experiences was a very unique experience for me. To hear these stories of people coming to India that had either had a dream or a moment or had met somebody and traveled this far to come and experience God was just a completely alien concept to me, growing up in the Baba family as a kid. And in a funny way, I was jealous. I was jealous of people finding Baba, because I never had that opportunity. I was just born into it. It was as if I had no choice in the matter. There was no option of deciding whether this relationship, this faith, was something I could decide for myself or not. So most of my childhood was sort of spent chasing that feeling of what's it like to actually discover Baba. And the more that didn't happen, the more frustrated I would get. So much so that, by the time I was 16, I started almost becoming, in a way, angry is not the right word, but, when you're let down by somebody or something, felt let down by Baba. Why? Well, I was born 1 year after he dropped the body. And in my mind, I was like, you couldn't wait 1 more year for me. And secondly, all of you were experiencing my family, which was not just my parents, but also the mandali and the extended mandali, differently than I was experiencing them. You all were coming and experiencing Baba through them, through the mandali. There was this incredible, intimate sort of filter through which you were learning about Baba. And when I say you, I don't mean everybody in this room, but the folks that were coming to India at that time. So you were experiencing, in my mind, all the different aspects of Baba's divinity through his mandali, through Mani, through Erich, through Pendu. And I wasn't experiencing that because I was sort of on the inside. So there was this always constant sort of inner burning sense of almost a resentment of what these Baba lovers coming to India had, and I didn't. Because for you, with the Erich, you just saw the humbleness and the obedience and the servitude to the Lord. With Mani, you saw her sort of grace and joy and wisdom. With Pendu, there was that sense of humor that he always had. With Padri, there was that sternness and that sort of inner moral fortitude. But to me, they were uncle and aunts, and all I saw in them was everybody telling me what I was doing wrong. They were my disciplinarians. So while you all would sit in Mandali Hall and hear Mani just tell her beautiful stories about her time in a child with Baba, I would get hauled out in front of Mani because I was being scolded or disciplined. Every time I met the mandali and had a real interaction with them, it was them speaking down to a child and telling me what to do and what not to do, and how to be a good Baba lover. So that, coupled with the sense that, well, if I'm born into Baba's family, shouldn't I be having some sort of special life? There were extraordinary circumstances, so shouldn't I be having an extraordinary life? And the fact that my life was anything but extraordinary, it was the most ordinary of lives growing up in India, at the time that it fell to me, it just really had put me in a very strange and interesting place in my relationship with Baba. So let's talk a little bit about growing up with the mandali. And I'm saying this through the lens now of age and time and being able to look back. What I realize now that each one of them was doing was, in a sense, showing not just me, but I think showing all of you, the fact that Baba was perfectly human too. It's easy for us to only see Baba as the Godhead and the divine. But time spent with the mandali, they got to experience the part of him that was also perfectly human. And those stories that they told you and that I would overhear sort of helped reaffirm in me that there's two ways to love Baba. One is through the divine and the spiritual aspect of him, and the other is through the human aspect of who he was as God-man on earth. And every one of them, when I look back, helped sort of forge some part of my relationship with Baba and an understanding of what it meant to be born into his family. From Mani, I could see this sort of, Mani could put on a show, right? She could turn it on. Didn't matter how she was feeling behind the scenes, because I'd see that. We'd come in early to Meherabad before the pilgrims arrive, and there was bickering and stress and running around and issues they were dealing with, and whether it was problems with the servants or the electricity or the water or financial issues. And that bus would show up and the doors would open and pilgrims would spill out, and instantly Mani would be just the absolute epitome of grace and beauty and articulation and just her intelligence. The same with Erich. I've seen, can you imagine seeing Erich angry? I don't know if any of you have ever seen him angry, but I've seen him so intensely angry that it was almost shocking, right? A human being too, he had emotions too. But then when the doors to the buses opened and the pilgrims poured forth, Erich in my mind just transformed into the essence of obedience to the Lord, the essence of unquestioning humbleness and obedience to the Lord. Every one of them, in their own way, had to transform when you all showed up. And the reason being because they felt the burden and the responsibility of being that conduit to Baba, given that, they were what were left when Baba dropped the body. And I saw each of them grow into those roles and become, in a sense, sort of the embodiment of these various attributes of the Lord. And looking back, I could tell that really influenced how I perceived not just them, but how I perceived, our avatar, the God-man. So I would say that part of growing up in India, I was more connected with the man part of Meherabad than the God part of Meherabad, if that makes sense. Got to see all the behind the scenes of the hardships and the struggles and the pettiness and the bickering and the back and forth, and recognizing now, looking back, that if we have to accept him as who he is, we have to accept both the God part and the man part, and be okay with that. You could be perfectly imperfect, because in my mind, that's, as I grew older, was my recognition of what Baba meant to me. Jamshid told some tales yesterday of us running around as kids in Meherabad. It was truly a magical time to be in Meherabad in the 70s and 80s, for those of you that went there. So I heard an analogy one day that, the advent of the avatar is like a bottle of perfume shattering. That when it first breaks, the fragrance is the most intense right where it breaks. But eventually the perfume dissipates, but it doesn't go anywhere, right? It just dissipates slowly, spreading further and further and further and further, until all of humanity gets just the tiniest, tiniest molecular drop of that fragrance. But you can just feel it. And I felt that I was there just 10 minutes after the bottle had broken, because that fragrance was so intense. You could see the folks coming to India just overwhelmed by it, and overwhelmed by that feeling of the fragrance of Baba. So when I was 20, I was tapped on the shoulder to go to the USA. Hang on, let me back up for a second. I've only had 3 dreams of Baba in my entire life. And I would say each dream fit perfectly as a part of my life. So let me talk about the first dream, and then I'll talk about coming to America. So when I was, I think I want to say 5 or 6, I had this dream. I barely remember the dream. I only remember pieces of it. But here's the dream. That I'm walking up Seclusion Hill, a young boy, holding Baba's hand. The sun is shining, a light breeze is blowing. The sun's behind Baba. So when I look at him, because of the glare of the sun, I can't really see his face. I can see his profile. But his hair, because it's standing up in the breeze, is glowing like a halo around him. And he's walking swiftly, he's strong, and he's holding my hand, and I'm running along to keep up with him. And we get to the top of Seclusion Hill. I don't remember exactly how we get there, but we get up to the top, and he lets go of my hand. And I look down, and it's terrifying. It's as if I'm 30,000 feet up in the air. Like when you're in an airplane and you look down and you see the earth below you. That's how far up I am. It's cold. There's black clouds circling overhead. The wind is whipping. There's thunder and lightning. And the entire earth beneath me looks like it's just churned up, completely torn up. And Baba let go of my hand. The next day, Jack Okarako, I don't know if you guys know Jack, he was staying in the trust office as a resident for a little while. And he used to come and visit my parents every now and then. He came bicycling over the next day and to visit my parents, but also to tell them about this dream that he had had the night before. And in this dream, Meherwan Irani is holding Meher Baba's hand, walking up a hill, and described it exactly the way I described it. And he too remembered that when I got to the top, Baba let go of my hand, right when I needed him the most. So, when I think back on that dream and think back of the childhood that I was describing to you, it felt like a metaphor for what I was feeling at the time. That, here I am trying to experience Baba as God, but instead I'm experiencing him as man because of, my relationship with the mandali. And all of you get to come and experience his divinity. And that's what it felt like, the metaphor of him letting go of my hand in that moment. So the second dream was when I was a teenager, just before I was getting ready to leave for America. In this dream, Baba is walking with a huge crowd of people around him, behind him, in a valley. I don't know where it is. It's no place that I ever remember having visited. It didn't seem like it was Ahmednagar. It felt like it was some beautiful valley. It was springtime, sun shining, birds are chirping, there's beautiful flowers and flora all around. And a huge, joyous crowd is walking behind Baba, and he's off somewhere. And it's almost like he's on a pilgrimage going somewhere. And I'm running along besides Baba, I'm running along in the back of the crowd with my little puppy dog. And somewhere along the way, I lose that puppy. And I start frantically searching for my puppy dog, this beautiful little puppy that I was so in love with. And while I'm searching, Baba's gone, the crowd's gone, and I'm still running around the valley looking for this dog that I can't find, calling out my puppy's name. And it's finally dark, and I finally have to give up and come trudging back. And the scene now is like I'm back in Vila Villa about to enter the dining room. And I open the door to enter the dining room, and there's Baba sitting at the head of the table with all those people that had seen him with him on the hill, all also seated in a table just infinitely long, miles and miles long. And on Baba's lap is my puppy. All right. So now it's 1990. As a 20-year-old, my parents decide that, it'd be right for me to go to America. I get a scholarship to go to the University of South Carolina in Columbia, South Carolina. And when I arrive in America, my first stopping place was at the center. And I sort of arrived there almost sort of being treated as a little bit of an Indian superstar, if you will. Everybody there knew my story. Everybody there knew that I was Baba's great nephew. And they went out of their way to be loving and kind and generous to me. And being in the center and running around the center was the first time where I started developing a different relationship with Baba, different from what it was like growing up in India. Here, all of a sudden, I didn't have the mandali telling me what to do and how to be and how to behave. I didn't have the angst of being a teenager growing up in Baba's family with some sort of expectation of who I'm supposed to be. Here, I felt like I was just free to be myself. I felt like the folks that lived there, the families, Jane, Kitty, just accepted me for who I was, with no expectation of how I was supposed to act or behave, given that I was born into Baba's family. And I started feeling that the Baba Center was more my real home than growing up in India. That Baba had said that this was, the home that he loved the most because it was given to him with love. And in a funny way, that sort of somehow washed over me. That this Baba's home in the West, ironically, is felt more like a home to me than it did growing up in India, where I just always felt out of place. And this is where I met Molly, my wife now, and Molly was Marshall's daughter. You can tell I just came off a 36-hour flight. And Molly and I sort of fell in love and started dating. And after a few short years living in Myrtle Beach, Molly and I moved to California and got married there. So let me forgive me. I'm trying to get the timeline straight. At my age, I'm starting to forget. Right. So I moved to California, and Molly and I got married in California. And it was just a beautiful wedding because of all the friends and family that came there that my parents knew. And I started a job in the car business. And at this point, I'd sort of given up, if you will, on the idea of having a intimate and personal relationship with Baba. I just had to accept that my relationship with Baba would be based purely on faith. And it seemed to me contrived to have a relationship just based on faith and not a relationship based on having a true experience. And I was okay with it. I'd reconciled that maybe it's all right to not truly believe in Baba because of a personal experience, but to believe in him just because of how I was raised and just having faith. It niggled at me. It niggled at me a lot, but I was okay with it. I was ready to start my life. I got married, started a job, started to work. And this is about the time where Baba said, oh, now he's prime. Now I'm going to start messing with him. When I'd finally just thrown my hands back and said, I'm giving up. I don't know what else I can do. And so I'll tell a couple of stories of how Baba sort of started sending me little messages in those early days of living in California. I was working, like I said, at a Lexus dealership. And My sales manager was just an awful human being of a man. His name was Keith Katz, and I just felt like he never liked me. Let me put it this way. Let me give you an anecdote of how Keith was. One Saturday, I sold 5 cars, which was a record set at the dealership. Nobody had ever done it. The next morning, Keith Katz walks in and says, "Hey, I heard you sold 5 cars yesterday." And I kind of puffed up my chest, expecting a little bit of congratulations. And he goes, "Well, even a blind pig finds an acorn every now and then." Right? Horrible man. So one day I walk in his office to ask for time off. I wanted to go to Myrtle Beach. And Keith says, "What do you need the time off for?" I said, "Well, I'm traveling to Myrtle Beach." He goes, "Myrtle Beach? Why are you going to Myrtle Beach?" I said, "Well, I'm going there to visit my family." And Keith goes, "Well, do you know what's in Myrtle Beach?" And I'm like, "What? I don't, what's he going to tell me?" He says, "The Meherabad Spiritual Center's in Myrtle Beach." Have you heard of it? After I picked my jaw off the floor, I'm like, "Yes, how have you heard of this?" And Keith goes, "Well, it's a funny thing. Did you know that when I was young, I used to be a cab driver," and Keith was about 60-something. "I used to be a cabbie in New York in my 20s. I'm like, "Really?" And he said, "Yeah." So he said, "I picked up this ride one day, and this gentleman," he said, "was dressed very nicely, was going to an event, and I was taking him to the Delmonico. And, on the way, I started talking to him, as I would as a cabbie, and asked him why he was going there. And he said, 'Oh, well, this Indian spiritual master was visiting from India, and there was an event at the Delmonico.' And as the guy got out of the car, when Keith dropped him off, he looks at Keith, and the cab driver, and says, 'Would you like to meet him?' So Keith says, 'Okay.' So he parks his cab, follows this gentleman inside, and Keith couldn't tell me who the gentleman was. I wish I knew who this person was. And Keith says he walks inside, and it's a large sort of I guess a banquet hall, banquet room. My memory's fuzzy. And he could tell off there somewhere at the end is this person who must have been the Indian mystic. And just as you got there, people were filing by, and this Indian mystic, Meherabad, was giving everybody a Baba button. So Keith just gets in line, files by, and gets his Baba button. And I'm like, "Keith, what did you do with the Baba button that Baba gave you?" And he goes, "Well, all cab drivers are very superstitious, and we all have little good luck charms to just, keep us, like from not getting mugged, or cars not getting, jacked or whatever it is." So he said I had a little box in which I had my lucky rabbit's foot and all these little things, and I kept the Baba button there. He called it a little kit. And he says, "I think I still have it." So the next day he comes in with his little box, and he opens it up, and inside there's a little Baba picture, one of those black and white old Baba pins. And I go, "Can I have it?" And he goes, "No, this is ever since I got this, my luck completely changed. It's been my good luck token for my entire life. There's absolutely no way I'm giving it away." And as time and the more time I spent just, in the state of resignment, the more Baba kept sending me these little signals, little pings. So one day I'm driving home, and I notice that my check engine light comes on in my car. And I just so happen to drive right past a service shop on Van Ness Avenue coming to San Francisco. So I just pull right in, and a young man comes out, and he looked like he could have been Indian, could have been Pakistani, sort of had an Asian, South Asian look about him, but very much, when he opened his mouth to speak, had an American accent. And he said, "How can I help you?" And I said, "Well, my check engine light came out on my dashboard, and I'm just curious if that's something I should be worried about right now." So he looked over the dashboard, looked at it, and he said, "Well, let me pop the hood and plug it in." So he pops the hood, plugs it in, and says, "No, it's just an oxygen sensor. It's fine. You can get it repaired at some other time." I'm like, "Great." So I'm, saying thank you and ready to leave, and he's sort of just standing there looking at me. And I said, "Can I help you?" And he said, "When I looked in your car, I saw a picture of a man on your dashboard. Who is that?" I said, "That's Meher Baba." And he says, "Do you have any material on him?" I said, No. Um, and I said, why are you asking? He said, I have dreams of him. And I said, okay. And all I could think of at the time was Rick Chapman had in Berkeley, what was called the box, right? And all I could think was to say, well, look for this person in the phone book, Rick Chapman, and he'll have material for you and Baba. And I gave it to him. So, the sort of, so this is kind of starting to happen. And there's 3 or 4 more other stories, but I'll jump to the main event. Molly and I go to, every year we had started going to Myrtle Beach for New Year's Eve. That had become our ritual. And we'd be in the Baba Center when New Year's Eve happened and the clock was counted down. And I had, for the 6 months leading up to going to New Year's Eve, really started diving into reading about Baba. Because you got to remember, growing up in India, I didn't read the Baba books because it was kind of like I was there, right? And the stories were being told to me. But just at that phase in life, I decided, I probably should start reading a little bit about Baba. And I'm reading the discourses, and I'm reading, all these Baba books. And all my mind can think of is the paradoxes in what Baba would say at different times to different people. And how, there seemed to be sort of no clear message that you could just sort of latch in and focus on that would help me say, oh, this is how I can experience Baba as God. And again, it was a frustrating experience reading, the discourses, reading the Everything and the Nothing, reading the Wayfarers, just reading all these books on Baba, because it just either kept doing one of 2 things. Kept reinforcing that everybody else but me has had an incredible experience of him, or that if you really stopped and used the intellect, there's a lot of, things don't always line up, that you kind of have to sometimes go past the intellect and just believe. And those things were bothering me. So I was sort of in a pretty much a worked up state by the time I got to this particular New Year's Eve in Myrtle Beach. And for those of you that have attended New Year's Eve in Myrtle Beach, it's a beautiful program. There's music and song, and then there's sort of like a potluck, and there's food. And then at 12 o'clock, well, at 11:45, they play Pete Townshend's O Pravartigar and do a countdown, and then everybody gets a little Baba quote. And I was just so worked up that for the first time, I decided I didn't want to be there for the countdown and for the last moment. I was just going to go back to my cabin and go to bed. So I went back to my cabin, and Molly was saying, "Are you sure you want to miss out on sort of, saying Baba's prayers and all that?" Yeah, I said, I'm just tired. I want to go back to my cabin. So I went back to my cabin, and that's where I had my 3rd dream. So in the dream, we're in Baba's house in Myrtle Beach. My mom is there, and we're in the kitchen of Baba's house in Myrtle Beach. And she's frantically running around, like stressed out, preparing food and bustling around. And I'm trying to help her. And in the other room, apparently, is Baba, waiting for his food. And I don't know if you've been to the house of Baba's house in Myrtle Beach. There's a kitchen, and there's a little room next to it. And Baba's sitting in that room. And my mom gives me a bowl of khichdi, which is rice and dal, something Baba used to eat in the last part of his life when he could only eat very light meals. Rice and dal cooked together. And she says, "Here, go give this to Baba." So I walk into the room where Baba is, and this is Baba just before, if you've seen the pictures, he dropped the body. Old, tired, in pain. And he's sitting on this chair in front of the little table, looking extremely uncomfortable and agitated. And he's sort of fidgeting and tapping his hands and looking stressed. And I come in, and for some reason, my instinct was to try to feed him. So I take the spoon and the bowl of khichdi, and I hold it up to him. But he's fidgeting so much that instead of me getting it close to his mouth, I get a little bit of on his face. So I remember trying to pick up a paper towel and try to wipe Baba's face because I'd gotten rice and dal on his mustache. And he just annoyedly pushes my hand away. Just sort of, like, because I'm bothering him. And then he looks at me, and again, this is Baba's voice, even though his lips are not moving. He looks at me and says, I know what you're doing. He said, you're trying to convince yourself that you need to experience me to believe in me. He said, I know what you're doing, and it's not going to work. And I woke up in a cold sweat, absolutely terrified that imagine having an experience. This is my first true, of all the dreams, this is the one that felt like the experience I was waiting for. And he's angry at me. He's angry it felt like at the choices I've made. He's angry at the fact that I'm not just believing in him, not having just faith in him. And I'm sitting here in the stunned sort of state. It wasn't yet, it wasn't the morning. I just woke up in the middle of the night. And it was 12:30, and Molly had just come back from the meeting place. And I told Molly this dream I had, and she said, what do you think it means? I said, I don't know, but he's obviously upset at me. And she said, well, I've got the Baba quote, maybe that'll help you out. And she pulls out the Baba quote, and I've lost this Baba quote, and I can't find it anywhere, and I wish I could remember exactly what it said. But essentially, the quote basically says something like, along the lines of, all you can have is faith. And it's okay to just have faith. Because faith leads to conviction. And conviction leads to experience. And in that moment, I feel my life changed. It was that I'd waited my whole life, waiting for Baba to tell me, you don't have to have an experience. You don't have to have a conviction. The single most important thing you can is just have faith. And the more faith you have, the more that'll lead to conviction. And the more conviction you have, that'll lead to an experience. And it may sound so obvious to you all listening to this, but you have to remember, I was born to his family. And no matter what, there was always this inner questioning of, am I not meant to be something other than what I am? Why would the Lord preordain my birth and my brothers, preordain everything, going back 3 generations to making sure that my mom's family would come to Baba, and put this all in motion just for me to be selling cars? They are nice cars. And I didn't realize until that moment that I'd been sort of carrying something my whole life. And that dream, when I woke up, I felt like Baba had essentially said, here, let me take that from you. And instantly, my relationships changed. My relationships with the mandali changed, who was left of them at that point. My relationships with my parents changed. My relationship with Baba changed. And as if Baba's saying, okay, welcome back, son. Let me show you the side of me that everybody sees. I'll give a story of one of these examples. So as I said, when I left India, to me in my mind, Mani was always the disciplinarian. As graceful and as, funny as she was with the pilgrims that were coming, in equal parts, she was, could be extremely sort of sharp and to the point and edgy when she was giving you discipline, which is what I would receive from her all the time. So I come back, this is an anecdote, I come back from America, and when Molly and I got engaged, we got engaged in India. And Mani insisted that we come back to India to get engaged. So here I come back for the first time after being gone for 4 years. On the engagement day, all the women mandali are there. They had sort of arranged the entire thing. It happened in my parents' home in Meherwan on the way to Meherabad. And I have never seen somebody be so sweet and loving and kind and beautiful as Mani was for me at that wedding. It's almost as if, she had, made sure that she had ground away any aspect of me that had any, illusions of being something other than just an ordinary person. And once I'd accepted that it was okay to be that, Mani was there for me. Here's a beautiful story about Mani. So after our engagement ceremony, she asked me and Molly to garland Baba's picture. And there was a picture of Baba on the wall in my parents' room. So we both garland the picture, and then Mani says, okay, now take the red dot, the little holy red dot that Molly and I had on our foreheads, and go ahead and put one on Baba's forehead also in the picture. Well, it's very hard on a flat two-dimensional picture to do a little bindi, on a little red strike on Baba's forehead. So I'm doing it sort of clumsily, and my hand is covering Baba's face as I'm trying to do this. And Manali gently takes my hand back and says, here, I'll do it for you. And she takes the little stick that had the little red dye on it, and she beautifully and gracefully puts the little line on Baba's forehead. This is a picture, mind you. And she stops and gazes at his picture, and then looks at me and says, look how beautiful he is. And that's the moment in which I saw Mani as the sister of Baba's, in love with her elder brother. And just the way she did it, it was like Baba was almost there. And then with Goher, a similar experience. And with Arnavaz, a similar experience. And Baba sort of like needed to send me away to America to doubt, to have, be plagued with, just my mind trying to work too hard to figure out who I was and what I was doing. And once that sort of like, in a sense, wiped the slate clean, the final blow being this dream in which he's mad at me, he said, now I will give you the experience that you all had when you come to India to meet the Mandali. So that's how I slowly fell in love with them the way you did. Fell in love with Erich's, grace and obedience and humility, and fell in love with, Naja's wanting to feed you till your stomach was going to explode. And fell in love with, Meru's sort of, for those of you that Meru, she was extremely stern, but behind that sternness was this absolute bundle of, love and sweetness. And I just felt as a 24-year-old, my heart finally opening up to Baba and having the experience that you all had there. And then, guys, I'm just telling you my life story. If you all are expecting some deeper inner stories, I think it's there, but it's woven in. I would argue most of you going to India probably have more powerful stories than what it was like. And that's when I also slowly started realizing that, how are we doing time? Okay. That's about the time when I slowly started realizing that Baba's message to me was not to worry so much about trying to live a extraordinary life. That Baba's message was to me was to live an ordinary life as perfectly as I could. And that became kind of my spiritual path, if you will. The recognition that I don't need to follow a spiritual path, if you will. I don't need to worry about how much I pray or think of him. I don't need to worry about what being born in his family means. I don't need to worry about being a good Baba lover. That all I had to worry about was just being a good human being, as perfectly as I could, flaws and all. And once that settled in my mind, everything changed. What do I mean by that? It suddenly became obvious that Baba was now in charge of the direction that my life would go. We left California, moved to Asheville, North Carolina, and in the height of the Great Recession of 2009, we opened Chai Pani. And the first month that we opened, it felt like a Sahaba's. There was probably 25 Baba kids working in that restaurant. Every day coming in was an affirmation of Baba's love. And for the first time, we got to then spread it out to all the people that were walking through the doors of this restaurant that didn't know anything about Baba. And Baba, again, as if to remind me over and over and over again that I finally put you on the right path, would continue to send me signals that, yes, you're doing the right thing, yes, you're doing the right thing, yes, you're doing the right thing. And I'll give you a couple of stories about some of these signals. Ruby Holmes, she now lives in Perth. She was one of her first managers at Chaipani. A lady comes in and goes to the bathroom and comes out of the bathroom and looks at Ruby and says, whose picture is that in the bathroom? And Ruby says, oh, well, that's a picture of Meherabad. And the woman starts weeping. She says, when I was young, I dreamt of him every night. I couldn't wait to go to sleep so that I could dream of him. I was in love with him. And then one day he stopped coming. And for 30 years, I haven't seen him anywhere else. Almost forgot what his face looks like. And I walk into your bathroom and see him there. And it reminded me again. Another story. This is all Baba just reminding me, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. Finally, I'm here. I'm in Chaipani and I see an Indian family sitting in one of the tables and they beckon me over. So I come over to chat with them, assuming they wanted to find out more about my Indian background. And we start talking and I say, yes, I'm from Pune and from Ahmednagar. And there was a younger couple, a husband and a wife, and their mom was there, and she looked like she was probably about in her 70s. And she said, oh, from Ahmednagar. I said, yes. She said, are you a follower of Meher Baba by any chance? And I said, yes, I am. She said, I met him when I was young. I'm like, tell me the story. And she said, when she and her friend their family lived in Pune, and they were driving back from Bombay to Pune by car when their car broke down. So they're stranded on the side of the road, and all of a sudden they see a convoy coming by. And the convoy stops, and a large man, she said he looked very Western, but he spoke with an Indian accent, a tall man wearing a tie and well-dressed, and I'm guessing Mr. Roche, came out and asked if they needed help. And when it was evident they needed a ride, the family that was stranded were all allocated amongst different cars, but this girl got to sit in the front seat of the car Baba was in. And she describes, that she said, we drove in complete silence. She said, I didn't know who this man was, but in the back he sat there in complete silence. The driver didn't say a word, and she said, I was a little girl and I didn't say a word. And when they arrived in Pune, they first went to Guru Prasad. And then they were dropped off there and then picked up by somebody else. So over and over, stories like this would just come down the pipeline in Chaipani. And the best way to sum up for me, growing up in India, growing up with the mandali, sort of coming back to India and experiencing them as the mandali and not just as family and disciplinarians, and reconciling, being born in Baba's family. I feel like my role is to essentially try to find a way to find that balance of why Baba comes to earth as man. It is not just to show us, the divine, and just not to show us the universal aspect of him, but also to show us the most human part of him. I mean, there's a reason, this is my belief, there's a reason, Baba took form in human form, with all the suffering and all the foibles of the human body and the human mind, even though there's God consciousness in there. And I feel like my role, and this is not something that came down from the heavens to me, it's just what I've been happy with, is it is not for me to tell the story of the spiritual part of Baba or his divinity. There are other people that have done that extremely well. There are other people that have written incredible books, and there's so many things of Babas themselves. But I feel my role, as best as I can in my own limited way, is to manifest the part of Baba that I believe is the human part of him, which I believe is an important part of his experience too, of him on earth as man. And how to do that is, the way Mani describes how Baba said, to be in the world but not of it. I remember, again, one of the mandali, and many of you may have heard this, talking about how Baba would often say that, there are two sort of paths to him. One is the spiritual path, the path of detachment, of renunciation, of giving up the ego, giving up, everything we're so attached to, and single-mindedly focus on him, and through that act of detachment is to find him. And he said, but the second is something great. It's harder. The second is to live the life in the world the way he would want you to live it. Be cheerful, not complain, to constantly do good, to constantly go around trying to figure out, in every situation I'm in, how can I do the most good to the people around me? And even though Baba said that was the harder part, for me it felt like that was the part that I was best suited to do. That I was not suited for the spiritual life and the spiritual path of renunciation. That I was best suited to be the other path to God, which is to be in the world and trying to do the absolute best you can as a human being. So that's my story, and I'm sticking by it. Jai Baba. Thank you. Oh, sorry. We got a little time.
Questions for Meherwan?
Did your relationship with Mr. Katz change after that?
No, he went back to being the same. And you would have thought it would have changed, right? That we had a moment together? No, it lasted 10 minutes.
Did you tell him about your whole history?
And the funny thing was, you'd think he would have asked me, well, how do you know Baba? No, he was so into his own story of Baba, he never asked me.
How did you change from car sales to restaurateur?
Right. Well, I mean, it is, again, such an odd path to have taken, right? There's no logic for how I ended up in this and that. I mean, it's easy for me to say now, looking back, that all along, Baba just hadn't preordained my birth, if you will. He had sort of preordained this journey that I would go through. And somehow or the other, the restaurant for me has become the conduit through which I'm able to do that thing that I'm talking about, just do the most good I can in the world. I've always been in love with food. I've always loved, my mom, if any of you have experienced her cooking, is one of the best cooks I know. And I always had in my head, even when I was in the car business, that surely somebody can do something about the state of Indian food in America. I just never thought it would be me. I mean, well, here, let me tell you a quick story of even how Baba made sure that the minute he turned the key with that dream, that everything would fall into place the way it would. So Baba's story, I was in real estate after cars. I had moved to Asheville, but didn't open the restaurant right away. It took about a year. I got into the real estate business. And then I had this epiphany that I want to be in the restaurant business and do this. So a particular building, the building that Chaipani's in, had come up for lease. And I'd gone and put in an application for the lease and met the landlord. And the landlord had asked some very difficult questions of me and Molly. Have you been in the business before? No. Do you have any experience running restaurants? No. How much money do you have to open this restaurant? None. And what kind of restaurant are you opening? Indian street food. How many Indians are there in Asheville? 2. And I left that interview thinking to myself, like, this is never going to happen. And I go back to my job, where I was working in real estate, and and the realtor was going to call me and tell me what decision the landlord had made. It wasn't just me trying to get the restaurant space. There were other restaurateurs that actually knew what they were doing, also trying to get the restaurant space, right? So the day off that I'm supposed to get the call, I'm back at work, and I'm a nervous mess. And some part of me is convinced that this is the place I'm meant to have. And if I don't get this place, I don't know if it's going to happen. So I'm sitting there praying to Baba, in my office. I don't even have a picture of Baba in my office at this point. And, in my head, I'm like, Baba, Baba, Baba. And then I suddenly remembered something that I used to make fun of a lot. My mom had given up eating coconut to Baba in exchange for, she thought my brother Jamshed was going to have the same degenerative disease that my dad has, retinitis pigmentosa. Apparently, at age 14 to 15 is when the first signs of it start to happen. And my brother had started blinking and complaining that he was having trouble with his vision. And my mom had taken him to see a doctor. And the doctor said, "Yes, ma'am, it looks like your son has the same disease that your father has." And of course, my mom freaked out and went to Mera. And Mera had said, heard her out and said, "Let's go pray to Baba." And Mera and Baba went to Baba's room and they prayed. And Mera prayed aloud, and my mom remembers what Mera said. She said, "Baba, look at Amrit. She's so distraught. You know, if there's any way in your infinite kindness, could you save her son from this disease?" And then she turned to my mom and said, "Why don't you give a love offering to Baba?" And my mom didn't have time to think, and she said, "Coconut." And she's never had coconut since then. And over the years, I've seen other people do stuff like that, throw stuff in the dhuni, right? Like giving away stuff. And I used to kind of always, like I said, growing up as a kid, I was, a little bit starting to get skeptical, right? So here I'm praying, and it suddenly pops in my head, ooh, worked for my mom. Maybe I should give up something. And I go, what should I give up? Pineapple. Who will ever miss pineapple, right? Would you miss pineapple? Would you ever wake up and go to yourself like, I can't have pineapple, right? I'm like, yeah, I can give up pineapple. So I said, Baba, if I get this restaurant space, I swear I'll never eat pineapple again. And one part of, that part of yourselves which can step outside of your body and kind of, look at how ridiculous you are, well, that part's looking down at me and saying, this is ridiculous. And besides, it doesn't work that way. You got to give up something that means something. And what meant to me more than anything in life after my wife was coffee. I loved coffee. I had one of those $3,000 espresso machines in the house. I would roast my own beans. I was drinking a coffee while I was praying. And I gave up the coffee. And I said to Baba, I said, all right, Baba, if this restaurant comes through, I'll give up coffee. And then I sat down, and that part of me that's talking over here says, it doesn't work that way. You have to give it up whether you get this thing or not. It's an offering, not a bargain. So I said, all right, Baba, just want you to know how much getting the space means to me. But whether I get it or not, I'm giving up coffee for the rest of my life. And I poured the last cup of coffee into the drain. And at this point, I'm so miserable, I'm like, I'm just going to go get some lunch. So I go over and I'm sitting down having lunch, and the phone rings. And answers the phone is my realtor. And he goes, you got the place. I'm like, oh my God, this is amazing. It doesn't end. I hang up the phone. I'm about to call Molly, and the phone rings in as Molly. And I'm like, hey, honey, you're not going to believe this. And she interrupts me and says, honey, the coffee machine's broken. My $3,000 espresso machine broke the moment I gave up coffee. So that's how I got in the restaurant business.